The coffee cup slipped from my fingers, crashing against the marble floor of the executive washroom as I heard my boss Marcus Wellington's voice echoing through the thin walls. He was in his office next door wide open as usual when he wanted everyone to hear his pronouncements. Sarah? Oh, she's just another employee. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. If this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Replaceable, really. Nothing special about her whatsoever. The laughter that followed from his audience of sycophantic vice presidents felt like knives against my skin. I stood there among the scattered porcelain pieces, my reflection fractured in the bathroom mirror, and smiled. If only they knew what they were really dealing with. I bent down to collect the broken pieces, each shard reflecting a different version of myself. The version Marcus saw was Sarah Chen, quiet administrative assistant. Always early to work, always staying late, always agreeable and invisible. The version my lawyer saw was Dr. Sarah Chen, holder of 3 advanced degrees in international law, corporate governance, and strategic management. The version my private banker saw was Miss Chen, inheritor of a substantial trust fund, and owner of multiple shell companies across 4 continents. But the version that would matter most was the one written in tiny print on page 47 of my employment contract, the one Marcus had signed without reading, the one his entire legal department had somehow missed during their review. I had been working at Wellington Dynamics for exactly 18 months, and every single day had been a masterclass in corporate psychology. Marcus Wellington had inherited the company from his father, a brilliant industrialist who had built an empire through careful planning and strategic thinking. Unfortunately, Marcus had inherited only the company, not the wisdom that built it. At 35, he ruled through intimidation, favoritism, and the kind of casual cruelty that small-minded people mistake for strength. He surrounded himself with yes-men who laughed at his jokes, agreed with his every decision, and enabled his worst impulses because their own positions depended on his approval. The irony was exquisite. Marcus thought he was so clever, hiring me at below-market wages, because I had agreed to work for less than what my predecessor earned. What he didn't realize was that I could afford to work for peanuts, because this job wasn't about the salary. It was about something far more valuable: information, access, and the perfect position to watch a corrupt system destroy itself from within. Every morning when I arrived at 7 sharp, 2 hours before Marcus stumbled in with his hangover and his inflated sense of importance, I had complete access to the executive floor. Every evening when I stayed until 9, long after he had left for whatever social function or expensive restaurant was entertaining him that night, I had the building virtually to myself. My official title was Executive Administrative Assistant, a role that Marcus and his cronies viewed as glorified secretarial work. They saw me as someone who scheduled meetings, answered phones, and fetched coffee. They never bothered to wonder why someone with my obvious intelligence and capabilities would accept such a position, or why I never seemed frustrated by the menial tasks they constantly assigned me. They certainly never questioned why I had specifically requested access to certain databases and filing systems that most assistants would never need. Marcus had approved every request with the casual dismissal of someone who couldn't be bothered to think about the implications. The truth was that my position gave me access to virtually everything that mattered in the company: financial records, personnel files, board meeting minutes, strategic planning documents, client communications, and most importantly, the private correspondence between Marcus and his inner circle. Every email that crossed his desk, I saw. Every phone call he made, I could listen to through the antiquated intercom system that he insisted on using, because it made him feel important. Every meeting he held, I was either present, taking notes, or had access to the recordings afterward. Marcus had a particular gift for making enemies, and over the past 18 months, I had watched him systematically alienate clients, demoralize employees, and make decisions that prioritized his own ego over the company's well-being. He had a special talent for taking credit for other people's successes while blaming them for his failures. The Henderson account, which had brought in $12 million in revenue last quarter, had been entirely developed by Jennifer Martinez in our strategy department. Marcus had not only taken full credit for the deal but had also used the success to justify giving himself a substantial bonus, while Jennifer received nothing more than a standard cost of living increase. The Morrison Project, which had revolutionized our manufacturing processes and saved the company millions in operational costs, had been conceived and implemented by David Park from engineering. Marcus had presented it to the board as his own initiative, complete with charts and projections that David had prepared. When David had tried to correct the record during a company meeting, Marcus had publicly humiliated him, suggesting that engineers should stick to their blueprints and leave business strategy to people who understood it. I had documented every instance of this behavior, every stolen idea, every undeserved credit, every act of workplace bullying and discrimination. My files were meticulously organized, cross-referenced, and backed up in multiple secure locations, but documentation was only part of my strategy. The real power lay in understanding the complex web of legal obligations and contractual relationships that governed Wellington Dynamics, relationships that Marcus had never bothered to fully comprehend. When I had first applied for this position, I had done so through a headhunting firm that specialized in placing highly qualified professionals in strategic positions. The firm, Blackstone Executive Search, was one of the most prestigious in the industry, known for their discretion and their ability to match exceptional candidates with unique opportunities. What Marcus didn't know was that Blackstone Executive Search was owned by one of my shell companies, and that my placement at Wellington Dynamics had been carefully orchestrated to achieve specific objectives. My employment contract was a work of art, crafted by some of the finest legal minds in corporate law. On the surface, it appeared to be a standard employment agreement with typical clauses about duties, compensation, and termination procedure. But buried within the dense legal language were provisions that would have made Marcus's blood run cold if he had bothered to read them carefully. Page 47 contained what we called the Strategic Consulting Clause, which outlined my true role within the organization and the scope of my authority in matters relating to corporate governance and strategic planning. The clause had been written in deliberately obtuse language, the kind of legal terminology that would put most people to sleep and that busy executives typically delegate to their legal departments for review. Unfortunately for Marcus, his legal department was headed by Robert Shaw, a man whose primary qualifications seemed to be his ability to play golf and his willingness to tell Marcus exactly what he wanted to hear. Robert had rubber-stamped my contract without giving it the scrutiny it deserved, more concerned with getting to his lunch appointment than with protecting his employer's interests. According to the Strategic Consulting Clause, I held what amounted to veto power over any major corporate decision that could impact the company's long-term viability or reputation. This included personnel decisions involving senior management, strategic partnerships, major financial commitments, and any actions that could expose the company to legal liability. The clause had been triggered automatically after my first year of employment, giving me authority that far exceeded what Marcus or anyone else in the company realized. But authority without leverage is meaningless, and leverage was something I had been accumulating since my first day on the job. Marcus's habit of conducting business through personal emails, text messages, and phone calls had created a treasure trove of evidence about his questionable practice. His casual discussions about inflating expense reports, his agreements to provide inside information to his golf buddies who worked for competitors, his explicit instructions to discriminate against female and minority job candidates, all of it had been carefully preserved and cataloged. The Henderson account situation was particularly damning. I had recordings of Marcus explicitly telling Robert Shaw to remove Jennifer's name from all client communications and to ensure that she received no recognition for the deal. He had been laughably explicit about his reasoning. Can't have the clients thinking we're dependent on some junior-level woman for our biggest wins. Bad for the company image. The fact that Jennifer held an MBA from Wharton and had 15 years of experience in strategic consulting apparently meant nothing to Marcus's fragile ego. Even more damaging were the recordings from his private conversations with board members, where he had systematically undermined other executives in order to consolidate his own power. Thomas Wright, the company's chief financial officer, had been privately described by Marcus as past his prime and lacking vision, despite the fact that Thomas had successfully navigated the company through 2 major recessions and had maintained consistent profitability throughout his tenure. Marcus had been actively campaigning to force Thomas into early retirement so that he could replace him with someone more personally loyal. The environmental compliance issues were perhaps the most serious. Wellington Dynamics operated several manufacturing facilities that were subject to strict environmental regulations, and Marcus had been systematically cutting corners to boost short-term profit. When Linda Rodriguez from our environmental compliance department had raised concerns about potential violations at our Texas facility, Marcus had instructed her to mind her own business and let the adults handle the big picture. 3 months later, when independent testing had revealed contamination levels that exceeded federal limits, Marcus had blamed Linda's department for failing to provide adequate oversight. I had been present during the phone call where Marcus instructed the facility manager to falsify environmental monitoring reports, and I had copies of the doctored documents that had been submitted to federal regulators. This wasn't just corporate misconduct, it was criminal behavior that could result in massive fines, criminal charges, and environmental damage that could impact entire communities. The fact that Marcus seemed to view it as just another business decision revealed the depth of his moral bankruptcy. The pattern was always the same. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus would make reckless decisions based on his own ego and short-term thinking, and when those decisions created problems, he would find someone else to blame. He had perfected the art of taking credit for successes while deflecting responsibility for failures, all while maintaining the image of a decisive leader who was simply surrounded by incompetent subordinates. His treatment of Rebecca Thompson had been particularly cruel. Rebecca was a brilliant marketing director who had developed the campaign that had increased our market share by 30% over the past 2 years. When a competitor had tried to poach her with a substantial salary increase, Marcus had refused to match the offer, claiming that the company couldn't afford to throw money at every employee who got a little attention. Instead, he had promoted his golf partner's nephew, a recent college graduate with no relevant experience, to be Rebecca's supervisor. Rebecca had quit within a month, taking her knowledge and contacts to our biggest competitor. Marcus had then blamed Rebecca's departure on her lack of loyalty, and had instructed HR to ensure that she received negative references if any potential employers called. This kind of vindictive behavior was not only ethically reprehensible but also potentially illegal, and I had documented every aspect of the situation, including the recorded conversation where Marcus had explicitly instructed HR to sabotage Rebecca's job prospect. The financial irregularities were equally troubling. Marcus had been using company resources for personal expenses, claiming business justifications for everything from his country club membership to his wife's shopping trips to Paris. The company credit card statements told a story of systematic abuse, with charges for expensive restaurants, luxury hotels, and designer clothing that had no conceivable business purpose. When questioned by the accounting department, Marcus would simply claim that everything was related to client entertainment or business development, and his authority as CEO meant that few people were willing to challenge his explanation. More seriously, Marcus had been manipulating quarterly earnings reports to maximize his own bonus compensation. The company's compensation structure included substantial bonuses for achieving certain financial milestones, and Marcus had been artificially inflating short-term profits by deferring necessary expenses and accelerating revenue recognition. This created the appearance of strong performance in the short term, but it was building up serious problems for the company's long-term financial health. I had spent months documenting these practices, working late into the evening to photograph documents and record conversations. My position as executive assistant gave me access to Marcus's calendar, his email accounts, and his private office, and I had used that access to build a comprehensive case against him. Every questionable decision, every ethical violation, every instance of fraud or misconduct had been carefully documented and preserved. The personal cost of maintaining this charade had been substantial. 18 months of pretending to be subservient to a man I despised, of nodding politely while he belittled other people, of watching him destroy careers and damage lives, while I gathered evidence for his eventual downfall. There had been countless moments when I had wanted to reveal the truth, to watch his face as he realized who he had been underestimating. But patience is a virtue in this kind of operation, and the more evidence I could gather, the more complete his eventual destruction would be. My colleagues had no idea who they were really working with. To them, I was just Sarah the assistant, the quiet woman who kept Marcus's schedule and answered his phones. They were polite but distant, the way people are with service workers who are present but not really seen. None of them bothered to engage me in substantive conversations about business strategy or company operations, despite the fact that I had advanced degrees in precisely those areas. Their assumptions about my capabilities were based entirely on my job title and Marcus's treatment of me, and I had done nothing to correct those assumptions. Jennifer Martinez had been particularly kind to me, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit in someone else who was undervalued by the company's leadership. She would stop by my desk occasionally to chat about weekend plans or to compliment my work on organizing the quarterly report. She had no idea that I was documenting Marcus's theft of her ideas, and that I was building a case that would eventually restore her rightful credit for the Henderson account. David Park was more reserved, but I could see the frustration in his eyes when Marcus took credit for his innovation. He was a brilliant engineer who genuinely cared about the company's products and their impact on customers, and watching Marcus corrupt that vision for personal gain was clearly painful for him. I had made sure to document not only Marcus's theft of David's ideas, but also the positive impact those innovations had on company performance, building a record that would eventually vindicate David's contribution. Thomas Wright, the CFO, had been with the company for over 20 years, and represented everything that Marcus was not: experienced, ethical, and focused on long-term sustainability rather than short-term gain. Marcus's campaign to force Thomas into retirement was not just personally vindictive, but strategically disastrous for the company. Thomas understood the business in ways that Marcus never would, and his removal would leave the company vulnerable to exactly the kind of reckless decision-making that Marcus specialized in. Linda Rodriguez, in environmental compliance, had become increasingly isolated as Marcus marginalized her department and ignored her warnings about regulatory violations. She was fighting a lonely battle to maintain the company's environmental standards, while Marcus systematically undermined her authority. I had made sure to document not only Marcus's interference with her work, but also the potential consequences of his environmental violations, building a case that would eventually vindicate her professional judgment. The board of directors was an interesting collection of individuals, some of whom were genuinely concerned about the company's welfare, and others who were more interested in maintaining their comfortable position. Marcus had been carefully cultivating relationships with the more pliable board members, while attempting to marginalize those who asked difficult questions about company performance and strategic direction. Chairman Harold Fitzgerald was an old friend of Marcus's father, and had initially been supportive of Marcus's leadership, but I had noticed growing concern in his questions about company direction and financial performance. Board member Patricia Williams, who had extensive experience in corporate governance, had been asking increasingly pointed questions about operational efficiency and employee retention. Marcus had been trying to limit their access to information and to control the narrative about company performance, but the documented evidence I had gathered would eventually make his deceptions impossible to maintain. My strategy had always been about time. Moving too quickly would have limited the scope of evidence I could gather and would have given Marcus and his allies time to mount a defense or cover their tracks. But waiting too long risked allowing further damage to the company and its employees, people who deserved better than Marcus's toxic leadership. The strategic consulting clause in my contract gave me the legal authority to act, but I needed to choose the moment when that action would be most effective, and when the evidence against Marcus would be overwhelming and indisputable. That moment was rapidly approaching. Marcus's behavior had been escalating in recent weeks, his arrogance and recklessness reaching new heights as he became increasingly confident in his position. The comment about me being just another employee was typical of his dismissive attitude toward people he viewed as beneath his notice, but it also represented a perfect opportunity to demonstrate just how catastrophically wrong his assumptions could be. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Marcus had been preparing his usual presentation full of inflated achievements and deflected blame. He had no idea that this meeting would be different, that the carefully constructed facade he had built around his leadership would finally crumble under the weight of documented evidence and legal reality. The strategic consulting clause would be activated, and 18 months of patient observation and careful documentation would finally bear fruit. I finished cleaning up the broken coffee cup and looked at myself in the mirror one more time. Tomorrow would begin the final phase of this operation, the phase where Marcus Wellington would discover that underestimating people has consequences, and that contracts have meaning even when you don't bother to read them, especially when you don't bother to read them. The elevator dinged softly as I reached the executive floor Monday morning, my arms laden with what appeared to be routine paperwork, but was actually the culmination of months of strategic preparation. Marcus was already in his office, feet propped up on his mahogany desk, barking orders into his phone about some deal he claimed to have orchestrated single-handedly. Through his open door I could see the familiar scene of self-congratulatory theater that had become his morning routine. He caught sight of me and waved dismissively, pointing toward the growing pile of documents on his desk that needed his signature. I had learned to read Marcus's moods like a meteorologist tracking storm patterns. This morning he was in what I privately called his emperor mode, the dangerous combination of arrogance and carelessness that made him particularly reckless with his words and actions. It was during these moods that he revealed the most about his true character, and I had long since stopped being surprised by the depths of his callousness. Today's phone conversation was typical of his approach to business relationships, treating clients like obstacles to be manipulated, rather than partners to be respected. The quarterly projections lay spread across my desk like battle plans, each number telling a story that Marcus would never bother to understand. Revenue was down 12% from the same period last year, employee turnover had reached critical levels, and client satisfaction scores were plummeting across all major accounts. These weren't random fluctuations or market conditions beyond the company's control. They were the direct result of Marcus's leadership philosophy, which seemed to prioritize short-term exploitation over long-term sustainability. I had been tracking these metrics since my first week on the job, cross-referencing them with Marcus's specific decisions and their implementation dates. The correlation was undeniable. Every major decline in performance could be traced back to one of his initiatives, whether it was cutting customer service staff to boost quarterly profits, implementing policies that drove away experienced employees, or alienating key clients through his abrasive negotiation style. The data painted a clear picture of systematic organizational destruction, disguised as dynamic leadership. The Henderson account situation had reached a new level of absurdity over the weekend. Marcus had called an emergency meeting with the client for Wednesday, ostensibly to discuss expanding their contract, but his real agenda was to take personal credit for the success of Jennifer's strategy, while simultaneously proposing changes that would undermine its effectiveness. I had reviewed his presentation materials, and they were a masterclass in corporate narcissism, filled with references to his visionary leadership and innovative approach, while completely ignoring the actual factors that had made the relationship successful. Jennifer had no idea what was coming. She believed that Marcus had finally recognized her contributions and was planning to give her the recognition she deserved. The irony was heartbreaking, watching her prepare additional materials for the client meeting, excited about the opportunity to present her ideas directly to the decision-makers she had been building relationships with for months. Marcus's plan was to have her present the technical details, while he claimed credit for the overall strategy, positioning himself as the mastermind behind her success. The environmental compliance situation had escalated dramatically over the weekend as well. Linda Rodriguez had discovered additional violations at the Texas facility, problems that could result in federal criminal charges if they became public. Her attempts to brief Marcus on the severity of the situation had been met with his usual dismissive arrogance, and he had actually instructed her to delay reporting the violations until after the quarterly board meeting. This wasn't just corporate misconduct anymore. It was a criminal conspiracy to conceal environmental damage, and Marcus was creating evidence of his guilt with every decision he made. I had spent Sunday evening reviewing the latest environmental monitoring reports and cross-referencing them with federal regulations. The violations were extensive and undeniable, affecting air quality, water contamination, and soil pollution in ways that could impact public health for decades. Marcus's decision to conceal these violations wasn't just illegal, it was morally unconscionable, prioritizing his personal reputation over the welfare of entire community. The documentation I had gathered would not only expose his criminal behavior but also ensure that the environmental damage was addressed before it could worsen. David Park had been working overtime to complete the Morrison project upgrades. Unaware that Marcus was already planning to present the innovations as his own creation at the board meeting. David's engineering brilliance had solved problems that had been plaguing the company for years, increasing operational efficiency by 35%, while reducing manufacturing costs by millions of dollars. Marcus's plan was to present these achievements as evidence of his strategic vision, claiming that he had identified the operational inefficiencies and directed David to implement specific solutions. The reality was quite different. David had identified the problems independently, developed the solutions through months of careful research and testing, and implemented the changes despite Marcus's initial skepticism and budget constraints. Marcus had actually opposed the project in its early stages, viewing it as an unnecessary expense that would delay more immediately profitable initiatives. It was only after the improvements had proven successful that Marcus had begun claiming responsibility for their implementation. Thomas Wright had been working on a comprehensive financial analysis that would expose the unsustainable nature of Marcus's accounting practices. But he had no idea that Marcus was already planning to discredit his report and force his retirement. The board meeting agenda included a discussion of organizational efficiency, which was Marcus's euphemism for removing executives who posed threats to his authority. Thomas's 20 years of institutional knowledge and his reputation for financial integrity made him a particular target, since his presence made it difficult for Marcus to continue his creative accounting practices. I had been monitoring Marcus's private communications with board members, documenting his systematic campaign to undermine Thomas's credibility. The strategy was typically underhanded, involving subtle suggestions about Thomas being out of touch with modern business practices and resistant to necessary change. Marcus had been particularly effective at exploiting the generational divide among board members, positioning himself as the forward-thinking leader who was being held back by outdated thinking from older executives. Rebecca Thompson's departure had created exactly the kind of vulnerability that Marcus's enemies could exploit, but he was too arrogant to recognize the danger. Rebecca had taken her extensive client relationships and industry knowledge to our biggest competitor, and she was already making overtures to several of our major accounts. Her intimate knowledge of our pricing strategies, operational capabilities, and strategic weaknesses made her an existential threat to our market position, but Marcus continued to dismiss her departure as inconsequential. The real problem was that Rebecca's replacement, Marcus's golf partner's nephew, was proving to be spectacularly incompetent. Bradley Morrison was a recent college graduate, whose primary qualifications seemed to be his family connections and his ability to laugh at Marcus's jokes. His attempts to manage Rebecca's former responsibilities had been embarrassingly unsuccessful, and several major clients had already expressed concerns about the declining quality of our marketing support. The Henderson account, which Rebecca had helped develop and nurture, was beginning to show signs of strain under Bradley's inexperienced management. Marcus's response to these problems was characteristically short-sighted. Rather than acknowledging his mistake in promoting Bradley, he was planning to blame the marketing department's struggles on Rebecca's sabotage and Jennifer's failure to provide adequate support. This deflection strategy might have worked in the short term, but it ignored the fundamental problem that Bradley simply wasn't qualified for his position, and that Marcus's decision-making process was fundamentally flawed. The board of directors was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about employee retention and client satisfaction, questions that Marcus was finding increasingly difficult to answer without revealing the extent of his mismanagement. Chairman Harold Fitzgerald had specifically requested detailed reports on both issues, and Patricia Williams had been asking pointed questions about the correlation between leadership decisions and organizational performance. Marcus's strategy was to control the narrative by presenting selective data and deflecting blame, but the comprehensive documentation I had gathered would make his deceptions impossible to maintain. My morning routine had become a carefully choreographed performance, designed to gather final pieces of evidence, while maintaining my cover as the unassuming assistant. I arrived early to photograph documents, stayed late to record conversations, and used every moment of access to Marcus's office and computer systems to build my case. The strategic consulting clause in my contract gave me legal authority to intervene, but I needed to ensure that my evidence was comprehensive and indisputable before taking action. The complexity of Marcus's misconduct required a multifaceted response. The environmental violations needed to be reported to federal regulators immediately to prevent further damage and protect public health. The financial irregularities needed to be documented for both the board of directors and potentially for law enforcement, if criminal charges were warranted. The employment law violations needed to be compiled for potential civil litigation by affected employees. The breach of fiduciary duty needed to be presented to the board in a way that would force immediate action. Each category of misconduct required different types of evidence and different presentation strategies. Environmental violations required technical documentation, regulatory correspondence, and expert analysis of monitoring data. Financial irregularities required accounting records, bank statements, credit card receipts, and audio recordings of Marcus's instructions to falsify reports. Employment law violations required witness statements, email correspondence, recorded conversations, and documentation of discriminatory policies and practices. The strategic consulting clause had been carefully crafted to give me authority in exactly these circumstances. The language specified that I could intervene when executive decisions posed threats to the company's legal compliance, financial stability, or reputation, and Marcus's behavior clearly met all three criteria. The clause also specified the procedures for implementing my authority, including requirements for board notification, documentation standards, and external review processes. Marcus had never bothered to understand the implications of the clause because he had never imagined that his assistant could pose a threat to his authority. His assumptions about my capabilities and intentions were based entirely on stereotypes about administrative staff and his own inflated sense of superiority. The idea that someone in my position could have advanced degrees, significant financial resources, and the legal authority to challenge his decisions was simply outside his conceptual framework. The irony was that Marcus had actually created the perfect conditions for his own downfall. His treatment of me as invisible had given me unprecedented access to sensitive information. His habit of conducting business through personal communications had created extensive evidence of his misconduct. His systematic alienation of competent employees had eliminated potential allies who might have warned him about the dangers of his behavior. His arrogance had prevented him from recognizing threats until it was too late to respond effectively. The timing of my intervention had been carefully calculated to maximize impact and minimize the possibility of effective countermeasures. The quarterly board meeting provided a natural forum for presenting evidence and implementing changes. The environmental violations created urgent legal imperatives that would prevent delay or deflection. The financial irregularities provided clear grounds for immediate action. The employment law violations created legal liability that the board would be forced to address. Jennifer's Henderson account presentation on Wednesday would provide the perfect opportunity to demonstrate Marcus's pattern of taking credit for other people's work. I had prepared comprehensive documentation showing the development of the account strategy, including Jennifer's original proposals, client correspondence, and meeting notes that clearly established her role in creating the successful relationship. Marcus's attempt to claim credit would be exposed in real time with incontrovertible evidence of his deception. David's Morrison project represented another clear example of Marcus's fraudulent behavior, and I had documented every stage of the project's development to establish David's role in its success. The engineering reports, testing data, and implementation timelines would demonstrate that Marcus had actually opposed the project initially and had only supported it after its success became undeniable. His planned presentation to the board would be revealed as an elaborate lie designed to steal credit for someone else's achievement. Thomas's financial analysis would provide the foundation for exposing Marcus's accounting manipulations and demonstrating the unsustainable nature of his business practices. The combination of Thomas's institutional knowledge and my documented evidence of Marcus's fraudulent behavior would create an overwhelming case for his removal. Marcus's plan to force Thomas into retirement would be revealed as an attempt to eliminate the executive most capable of exposing his misconduct. Linda's environmental compliance reports would demonstrate the criminal nature of Marcus's environmental violations and the immediate danger his decisions posed to public health and company liability. Her professional expertise and documented warnings would establish that Marcus had been repeatedly informed about the violations and had deliberately chosen to conceal them. His instructions to delay reporting would be presented as evidence of criminal intent and conspiracy. The board's fiduciary responsibilities would require immediate action once they were presented with documented evidence of Marcus's misconduct. Delaware corporate law, which governed Wellington Dynamics, imposed specific obligations on directors to address executive misconduct and protect shareholder interests. Failure to act on clear evidence of criminal behavior, financial fraud, and regulatory violations would expose individual board members to personal liability. My preparation had included detailed research into each board member's background, motivations, and potential responses to the evidence I would present. Chairman Harold Fitzgerald's long friendship with Marcus's father would create emotional conflict, but his legal training and fiduciary responsibilities would ultimately require him to prioritize the company's welfare. Patricia Williams's experience with corporate governance would help her understand the legal implications of Marcus's behavior and the necessity of immediate action. The documentation I had assembled was organized into separate binders for each category of misconduct, with executive summaries, supporting evidence, and recommended actions clearly outlined. Environmental violations occupied 2 thick binders with regulatory correspondence, monitoring data, expert analysis, and recorded conversations. Financial irregularities filled 3 binders with accounting records, bank statements, expense reports, and audio evidence of fraudulent instruction. Employment law violations required 4 binders documenting discrimination, harassment, retaliation, and systematic abuse of authority. Each binder included a legal analysis prepared by external counsel, expert opinions from relevant specialists, and recommendations for immediate corrective action. The environmental binder included opinions from environmental lawyers and engineering consultants confirming the severity of the violations and the necessity of immediate remediation. The financial binder included opinions from forensic accountants and securities lawyers documenting the extent of the fraud and potential criminal liability. The employment binder included opinions from labor lawyers and human resources experts outlining the company's exposure to civil litigation and regulatory sanction. The strategic consulting clause gave me authority to present this evidence directly to the board and to require immediate action to address the identified problem. Marcus's authority as CEO would be superseded by the clause's provisions, and any attempts to interfere with the implementation of corrective measures would constitute breach of contract and potentially criminal obstruction. The clause had been designed specifically to prevent executive misconduct from continuing when it posed threats to corporate welfare, and Marcus's behavior clearly triggered every provision. Tuesday afternoon brought the first signs that Marcus was beginning to sense potential threats to his position. He had scheduled private meetings with several board members, ostensibly to discuss quarterly performance, but actually to preemptively defend his record and discredit potential critics. His strategy was typically manipulative, combining selective presentation of favorable data with subtle attacks on the credibility of employees who might challenge his narrative. I monitored these conversations through the antiquated intercom system that Marcus insisted on using, documenting his attempts to undermine Thomas's credibility and Jennifer's contributions while inflating his own role in company successes. Each conversation provided additional evidence of his fraudulent behavior and his systematic attempt to deceive the board about his performance and the company's actual condition. The Henderson client meeting on Wednesday would be Marcus's last opportunity to demonstrate his standard operating procedure before facing the consequences of his action. I had prepared comprehensive documentation of Jennifer's role in developing the account relationship, including her original strategic proposals, client correspondence, meeting notes, and performance metrics that clearly established her contribution. Marcus's attempt to claim credit would be exposed with precision timing and incontrovertible evidence. Jennifer had no idea that Wednesday's meeting would become a turning point in her career and in the company's future. She was preparing her technical presentation with characteristic thoroughness, excited about the opportunity to present her ideas directly to the clients she had been working with for months. Marcus's plan to steal credit for her work would backfire spectacularly when the evidence of her contributions was presented immediately following his fraudulent claim. The environmental violations had reached a critical point where delay was no longer possible without risking criminal prosecution for all involved parties. Linda's latest monitoring reports showed contamination levels that exceeded federal limits by dangerous margins, and her professional obligations required immediate reporting to prevent further public health risks. Marcus's instructions to delay reporting had created a criminal conspiracy that would be exposed as part of the broader pattern of misconduct. David's Morrison Project innovations had been successfully implemented across all manufacturing facilities, generating the cost savings and efficiency improvements that Marcus planned to claim as his own achievement. The engineering documentation would clearly establish David's role in identifying problems, developing solutions, and implementing improvements despite Marcus's initial opposition and ongoing interference. Thomas's financial analysis had identified accounting irregularities that went far beyond creative bookkeeping into the realm of securities fraud and criminal misconduct. His report would provide the foundation for board action and potential law enforcement referral, establishing a clear record of Marcus's financial crimes and their impact on company performance and shareholder value. Wednesday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of a day when long-planned events would finally unfold according to careful design. Marcus was in his office early, rehearsing his presentation for the Henderson client meeting and preparing his fraudulent claims about the account's development and management. He had no idea that every word he spoke was being recorded and that his planned deception would be exposed within hours of its delivery. The strategic consulting clause would be activated immediately following the client meeting, beginning a process that would systematically dismantle Marcus's authority and expose the full extent of his misconduct. 18 months of careful observation, documentation, and preparation were about to culminate in a comprehensive reckoning that would transform Wellington Dynamics and hold Marcus accountable for his actions. I reviewed my final preparations one last time, ensuring that every piece of evidence was properly organized and that every legal requirement had been satisfied. The moment had arrived to demonstrate that contracts have consequences, that underestimating people can be fatal, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, ultimately prevails when pursued with patience, intelligence, and unwavering determination. The conference room gleamed under the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows as I arranged the final documents for what would become Marcus Wellington's professional execution. He strutted in at precisely 9:30, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Behind him trailed the Henderson account executives, three sharp-suited professionals who had built their relationship with our company entirely through Jennifer's expertise and dedication. Marcus had no idea that today's performance would be his last as CEO of Wellington Dynamics. Jennifer entered the room clutching her presentation materials, her face bright with anticipation for what she believed would finally be her moment of recognition. She had spent the weekend perfecting her technical analysis, preparing detailed charts that demonstrated the innovative approaches she had developed for the Henderson portfolio. The irony was devastating to witness, knowing that Marcus planned to steal credit for her work while she remained blissfully unaware of his treachery. I settled into my corner seat with my tablet, officially there to take meeting notes, but actually positioned to document every word of Marcus's fraudulent performance. The Henderson team consisted of Chief Operating Officer Margaret Hendricks, Strategic Director James Chen, and Financial Analyst Victoria Rodriguez, three professionals who had worked exclusively with Jennifer throughout the development of their account strategy. They greeted her warmly, immediately engaging in technical discussions about implementation timelines and performance metrics. Marcus watched this interaction with barely concealed irritation, clearly uncomfortable with the obvious rapport between Jennifer and the clients he intended to claim as his own conquest. Margaret Hendricks opened the meeting with characteristic directness, addressing Jennifer while barely acknowledging Marcus's presence. "Jennifer, your quarterly analysis exceeded our expectations completely. The cost reduction strategies you proposed have already generated savings beyond our most optimistic projections." She gestured toward a thick folder of documents. Our board specifically requested this expansion meeting to discuss how we can implement your methodologies across our entire operational framework. Marcus's jaw tightened as he realized the clients were giving credit directly to Jennifer for strategies he had planned to claim as his own innovation. His carefully rehearsed presentation about visionary leadership and strategic oversight was already crumbling before he had spoken a single word. Miss Chen compounded Marcus's discomfort by pulling out detailed correspondence that clearly identified Jennifer as the primary strategic contact for all major decisions throughout the account development process. The implementation timeline Jennifer developed has become our template for similar projects across 3 different divisions. James continued, spreading out charts and timelines that bore Jennifer's signature and contact information on every page. We've actually recommended her approach to 2 other companies in our industry consortium. The level of detailed analysis and practical application she provided was unprecedented in our experience with consulting relationships. Victoria Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically, adding her own praise for Jennifer's financial modeling and risk assessment protocols. The contingency planning Jennifer built into the cost projections has already saved us from 2 potential budget overruns that our internal team completely missed. Her understanding of our operational constraints and market pressures was remarkably sophisticated for someone working with limited information about our internal process. I watched Marcus's face cycle through a spectrum of emotions as he realized that his planned deception was becoming impossible to execute. The clients weren't just giving Jennifer credit for individual contributions. They were specifically identifying her as the strategic architect of everything Marcus had intended to claim as his own vision. His presentation materials, filled with references to his leadership and innovative thinking, were becoming more ridiculous with each client testimonial about Jennifer's expertise. Jennifer's confusion was evident as she tried to redirect credit toward the broader team effort, while Marcus sat in stunned silence. I really appreciate your confidence in the strategies we developed, but this was definitely a collaborative process involving multiple departments and significant input from senior leadership, she said diplomatically, glancing toward Marcus with an expression of puzzled concern about his unusual quiet demeanor. Margaret Hendricks laughed warmly, shaking her head with amusement at Jennifer's modesty. Jennifer, we've been in this business for 20 years, and we know the difference between collaborative input and individual brilliance. Every communication we received came directly from you. Every innovative solution originated from your analysis, and every successful implementation followed protocols you personally designed. We're not interested in corporate diplomacy. We're interested in expanding our relationship with the person who actually created these results. Marcus finally found his voice, launching into a desperate attempt to reclaim control of the narrative. Well, naturally, Jennifer's excellent execution of our strategic framework reflects the kind of visionary leadership that I've been implementing since taking over the company's operations, he began, his tone carrying the forced confidence of someone improvising under pressure. The Henderson account success demonstrates the effectiveness of the comprehensive business philosophy that I've been developing to optimize client relationships across all our major partnerships. The silence that followed Marcus's intervention was profound and uncomfortable. Margaret Hendricks exchanged glances with her colleagues before responding with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed skepticism. Wellington, I'm sure your overall leadership contributes to your company's success, but our experience has been specifically with Jennifer's individual expertise and personal attention to our account requirements. We're here today because we want to expand that specific working relation. Miss Chen reinforced the point with devastating precision. Our contract explicitly requests Jennifer as the primary strategic contact for any expanded services. We've structured our approval process around her continued involvement because our board has confidence in her specific methodologies and analytical capabilities. Any changes to that arrangement would require renegotiation of our entire engagement structure. Marcus's face flushed red as he realized that the clients were not only refusing to give him credit for Jennifer's work, but were actually contractually requiring her involvement for future business. His planned presentation about strategic vision and executive leadership was not just irrelevant, it was actively undermining his credibility with clients who clearly understood the actual source of the account's success. Victoria Rodriguez delivered what amounted to a final blow to Marcus's credibility by addressing Jennifer directly about technical aspects of the financial modeling that had been central to the account's success. The risk assessment protocols you developed have been so effective that our parent company wants to license your methodology for use across their entire portfolio of subsidiaries. We're prepared to discuss a consulting agreement that would compensate you directly for intellectual property development and implementation support. The room fell silent as the implications of this statement settled over everyone present. The clients were not only giving Jennifer full credit for the account's success, they were offering to pay her directly for her innovations, bypassing Wellington Dynamics entirely. Marcus's expression shifted from embarrassment to panic as he realized that his attempt to steal credit for Jennifer's work had backfired spectacularly, potentially costing the company a major client relationship. Jennifer's professional composure was admirable as she navigated the increasingly awkward situation. I'm extremely flattered by your confidence in the work we've done together, but any consulting arrangements would need to be coordinated through Wellington Dynamics and our existing contractual framework. I'm committed to ensuring that our companies maintain the kind of productive relationship that has made this account so successful. Margaret Hendricks nodded approvingly at Jennifer's diplomatic response while making it clear that her preference remained unchanged. Of course, we respect your company's policies and procedures. However, we want to be absolutely clear that our continued engagement depends on Jennifer's ongoing involvement in strategic development and implementation oversight. We're prepared to adjust our budget and timeline requirements to ensure that arrangement remains in place. Marcus made one final desperate attempt to assert his authority and reclaim some semblance of control over the situation. Naturally, Jennifer will continue to play an important role in account management, working under the strategic guidance and executive oversight that has made this relationship so productive. Wellington Dynamics prides itself on the collaborative leadership approach that allows talented team members like Jennifer to execute the visionary strategies developed at the executive level. The condescending tone of Marcus's response triggered an immediate shift in the room's atmosphere. Margaret Hendricks's expression hardened noticeably as she recognized the attempt to diminish Jennifer's contributions while claiming credit for her innovations. Miss Chen closed his portfolio with a sharp snap that conveyed his irritation with Marcus's transparent manipulation. Victoria Rodriguez's smile disappeared entirely as she processed the implications of Marcus's comments about Jennifer working under his guidance. Miss Wellington, Margaret Hendricks said with ice-cold professionalism, I want to be absolutely clear about our position regarding this account relationship. Jennifer Martinez has been our sole strategic contact throughout this engagement. Every innovative solution, every successful implementation, and every positive outcome has resulted from her individual expertise and personal attention to our requirements. Any suggestion that she was merely executing someone else's vision is factually incorrect and professionally insulting. Miss Chen reinforced the point with equal firmness. Our documentation shows that Jennifer initiated every major strategic discussion, developed every innovative approach, and solved every complex problem we encountered during this engagement. We have email records, meeting notes, and recorded calls that clearly establish her role as the primary architect of this account's success. Any attempt to characterize her contributions differently contradicts our direct experience and documented evidence. Victoria Rodriguez added the final element of client displeasure with Marcus's behavior. We came to this meeting with enthusiasm about expanding our relationship based on Jennifer's demonstrated capabilities. Miss Wellington's attempt to minimize her contributions and claim credit for her innovations raises serious questions about your company's integrity and our confidence in continued collaboration. The meeting had transformed from Marcus's planned credit theft ceremony into a comprehensive repudiation of his competence and credibility. The clients were not only refusing to accept his false narrative, they were actively defending Jennifer's rightful recognition while expressing doubts about the company's leadership and ethical standards. Marcus's face had progressed from red to purple as he struggled to process the complete failure of his manipulative strategy. Jennifer's discomfort was evident as she tried to salvage what remained of the client relationship while processing the shocking revelation of Marcus's attempted deception. I apologize for any confusion about roles and responsibilities, she said carefully. Perhaps we should focus on the specific expansion opportunities you mentioned and table any discussions about internal organizational matters for separate consideration. Margaret Hendricks agreed with Jennifer's suggestion while making her position unmistakably clear. You're absolutely right, Jennifer. Let's discuss the expansion parameters we've developed based on your strategic recommendation. However, I want to reiterate that any expanded engagement will require your continued primary involvement and will be structured to ensure appropriate recognition and compensation for your individual contribution. Marcus realized that his presence had become not just irrelevant but actively harmful to the client relationship. His attempt to claim credit for Jennifer's work had exposed his fundamental incompetence while alienating clients who clearly understood the actual source of the account's success. Any further attempts to assert his authority would likely result in losing the Henderson account entirely, along with the substantial revenue it represented. Perhaps I should let Jennifer handle the technical aspects of the expansion discussion while I address some urgent matters that require executive attention, Marcus said with as much dignity as he could manage. His retreat from the meeting was a tacit admission that his claimed expertise was fraudulent and that Jennifer was indeed the driving force behind the account's success. As Marcus left the conference room, I observed the immediate improvement in atmosphere that followed his departure. The Henderson executives, visibly relaxed, and their conversation with Jennifer became more animated and productive as they discussed expansion possibilities without the distraction of Marcus's manipulative presence. Jennifer's expertise and professionalism were on full display as she addressed complex strategic questions with the kind of detailed knowledge that can only come from genuine understanding and personal involvement. The contrast between Jennifer's substantive contributions and Marcus's empty posturing was stark and undeniable. While Marcus had spoken in vague generalities about leadership and vision, Jennifer provided specific examples, detailed analyses, and practical solutions that directly addressed the client's needs and concerns. The meeting continued for another hour after Marcus's departure, with the Henderson team and Jennifer developing preliminary frameworks for expanded collaboration that could potentially triple the account's value. I documented every aspect of the failed meeting, from Marcus's botched attempt at credit theft to the client's emphatic recognition of Jennifer's contribution. The audio recordings would provide clear evidence of Marcus's fraudulent behavior and his systematic attempt to undermine the employee actually responsible for the company's success. More importantly, the meeting had demonstrated the actual consequences of Marcus's leadership approach, showing how his narcissistic manipulation damaged client relationships and threatened company revenue. The Henderson meeting was scheduled to conclude at 11:30, providing perfect timing for the next phase of my carefully orchestrated plan. The quarterly board meeting was set to begin at 1 o'clock, giving me precisely 90 minutes to implement the strategic consulting clause and present the comprehensive evidence I had gathered about Marcus's misconduct. The failed client meeting would serve as a real-time demonstration of his incompetence, providing immediate context for the broader pattern of destructive behavior I was prepared to expose. Marcus retreated to his office after the meeting disaster, presumably to develop damage control strategies and prepare explanations for the board about why a major client had essentially rejected his authority while demanding continued access to an employee he had systematically undervalued. His phone calls over the next hour provided additional evidence of his characteristic approach to crisis management, which involved blaming everyone except himself for the problems his decisions had created. I listened through the intercom system as Marcus attempted to spin the Henderson meeting as a negotiating tactic designed to extract better terms from clients who had become too dependent on individual employees. His conversation with Robert Shaw, the company's ineffective legal counsel, revealed his intention to characterize the client's explicit preference for Jennifer as a form of manipulation that required firm executive response. The idea that clients might genuinely prefer working with competent employees rather than incompetent executives was apparently outside Marcus's conceptual framework. Marcus's call to Chairman Harold Fitzgerald provided particularly damaging evidence of his systematic dishonesty and blame-shifting behavior. "Harold, we've got a situation with the Henderson account where they're trying to bypass our executive oversight and work directly with junior staff," Marcus explained, completely mischaracterizing the meeting's event. I think we need to discuss implementing stronger policies about client contact protocols to prevent this kind of inappropriate manipulation of our employee relationship. The conversation continued with Marcus describing Jennifer's professional competence as overstepping her authority, and the client's preference for working with her as an attempt to undermine our management structure. His ability to transform his own failure into criticism of the employee who had actually created the account's success was remarkable in its audacity and self-deception. Every word provided additional evidence of the narcissistic personality disorder that made him fundamentally unsuited for leadership responsibility. Harold Fitzgerald's responses suggested growing concern about Marcus's judgment and decision-making capability. Marcus, if the client specifically requested expanded services based on Jennifer's work, shouldn't we be celebrating that as evidence of our staff's capabilities rather than treating it as a management problem? The chairman's question revealed his recognition that Marcus's perspective on the situation was both counterproductive and potentially damaging to important client relationships. Marcus's answer demonstrated his complete inability to accept responsibility for his failures or recognize other people's contributions. Harold, the problem is that we can't allow individual employees to develop personal relationships with clients that bypass our strategic oversight. If we let staff members negotiate directly with clients about expanded services, we lose control over pricing, scope, and strategic direction. Jennifer may be competent at technical execution, but she lacks the executive perspective necessary for high-level business relationships. The irony was breathtaking. Marcus was criticizing Jennifer for the very competencies that had made the Henderson account successful, while claiming that his strategic oversight was necessary for relationships that had flourished specifically because of his minimal involvement. His systematic effort to diminish Jennifer's contributions while inflating his own importance provided perfect evidence of the fraudulent behavior I was prepared to expose to the board. Harold Fitzgerald's growing skepticism was evident in his final comments before ending the call. Marcus, I think we need to discuss this situation more thoroughly during today's board meeting. I'd like to review the actual documentation about how the Henderson account was developed and managed before making any decisions about policy changes or personnel management. The chairman's request for documentation was exactly the opening I needed to present the comprehensive evidence I had prepared. Patricia Williams called Marcus within minutes of his conversation with Harold, having apparently been briefed about the Henderson situation through board member communication. Her questions were more pointed and legally sophisticated than Harold's, focusing on potential liability issues related to client management and employee relations. Marcus, if clients are specifically requesting continued access to particular employees based on documented performance, we need to be very careful about any policies that could be perceived as retaliatory or discriminatory. Marcus's response to Patricia revealed his complete ignorance of employment law and his dangerous tendency to make decisions based on personal grievances rather than business consideration. Patricia, I understand your concerns about legal compliance, but we can't allow employees to hold the company hostage by developing exclusive client relationships. If Jennifer thinks she can use client preference to demand special treatment or additional compensation, she's going to learn that executive authority still means something at this company. Patricia's shock at Marcus's implicit threat against Jennifer was audible even through the intercom system. Marcus, I need to be very clear about something. Any personnel action that could be perceived as retaliation against an employee for client preference or professional success would expose the company to significant legal liability. We absolutely cannot take any action that could be characterized as punitive toward Jennifer based on the Henderson situation. The legal warning fell on deaf ears as Marcus continued to characterize Jennifer's success as a threat to his authority rather than an asset to be celebrated and leveraged. His conversation with Patricia provided additional evidence of his fundamental unsuitability for executive responsibility and his dangerous tendency to prioritize personal ego over business welfare and legal compliance. David Park's morning had been consumed with finalizing the Morrison project documentation that Marcus intended to present as his own achievement during the board meeting. David remained unaware of Marcus's plan to steal credit for his innovations, working diligently to prepare technical presentations that Marcus would claim reflected his strategic vision and executive leadership. The engineering brilliance that David had developed over months of careful research and testing was about to become another example of Marcus's systematic theft of employee contribution. The Morrison project had revolutionized the company's manufacturing processes, increasing efficiency by 35% while reducing costs by millions of dollars annually. David's innovations had solved problems that had plagued the company for years, implementing solutions that required deep technical expertise and creative problem-solving abilities that Marcus completely lacked. The project's success represented exactly the kind of employee achievement that competent leadership would celebrate and reward rather than steal and misrepresent. Thomas Wright spent his morning putting finishing touches on the financial analysis that would expose the unsustainable nature of Marcus's accounting practices and strategic decisions. His 20 years of institutional knowledge and reputation for financial integrity had enabled him to identify patterns of manipulation and fraud that less experienced analysts might have missed. Thomas had no idea that Marcus was planning to use the board meeting to force his retirement and eliminate the executive most capable of exposing financial misconduct. The comprehensive financial report that Thomas had prepared documented declining performance across multiple metrics, directly correlating with Marcus's specific decisions and policy implementation. Revenue trends, profit margins, client retention rates, employee turnover statistics, and operational efficiency measures all painted a clear picture of organizational decline under Marcus's leadership. The data was objective, quantifiable, and devastating to any honest assessment of Marcus's performance. Linda Rodriguez had spent her morning updating environmental compliance reports that revealed the full extent of violations at the Texas facility and other company locations. Her professional expertise and documented warnings provided clear evidence that Marcus had been repeatedly informed about regulatory violations and had deliberately chosen to conceal them rather than address them appropriately. The environmental situation had progressed beyond mere compliance issues into the realm of criminal behavior that posed serious risks to public health and company liability. The latest monitoring data showed contamination levels that exceeded federal limits by dangerous margins, creating immediate health risks for surrounding communities and potential criminal liability for company executives who had knowledge of the violation. Linda's attempts to brief Marcus about the severity of the situation had been documented through email correspondence and recorded phone calls that would provide clear evidence of his criminal intent to conceal environmental damage. As noon approached, I made final preparations for activating the strategic consulting clause that would transform me from overlooked assistant to the executive authority, capable of holding Marcus accountable for his misconduct. The clause had been carefully crafted to provide exactly the legal framework necessary for the situation that Marcus's behavior had created, giving me authority to intervene when executive decisions posed threats to corporate welfare, legal compliance, and fiduciary responsibility. The documentation I had assembled over 18 months of careful observation would support immediate action to remove Marcus from his position and implement comprehensive reforms to address the damage his leadership had caused. Environmental violations would be reported to federal regulators. Financial irregularities would be investigated by forensic accountants. Employment law violations would be addressed through policy changes and potential civil litigation, and the systematic theft of employee contributions would be exposed and corrected. Marcus remained in his office, presumably preparing his fraudulent presentation for the board meeting, while remaining completely unaware that his authority was about to be superseded by contractual provisions he had never bothered to understand. His confidence in his untouchable position was about to be shattered by the legal consequences of his own careless decision-making and systematic misconduct. The board members were arriving for the 1 o'clock meeting, each carrying their own concerns about company performance and leadership effectiveness. Harold Fitzgerald's questions about the Henderson situation had prepared him to be receptive to evidence about Marcus's management failure. Patricia Williams's legal expertise would help her understand the implications of the misconduct I was prepared to expose. The other board members would be forced to confront the reality of Marcus's incompetence and the necessity of immediate action to protect their own fiduciary responsibility. Jennifer remained in her office, processing the morning's shocking revelation about Marcus's attempt to steal credit for her work while preparing for what she believed would be a routine board presentation about account performance. She had no idea that the Henderson meeting had been the catalyst for a comprehensive reckoning that would expose Marcus's systematic misconduct and potentially transform her career prospects within the company. David continued working on technical documentation that Marcus planned to misrepresent, unaware that his innovations would soon receive appropriate recognition and that his contributions would be protected from future theft. Thomas refined his financial analysis, not knowing that his report would provide crucial evidence for board action against Marcus. Linda updated her environmental compliance documentation, unaware that her warnings would finally receive the serious attention they deserved. The clock approached 1 o'clock as all the elements of Marcus's downfall converged in perfect synchronization. 18 months of careful planning, systematic documentation, and strategic patience were about to culminate in a comprehensive demonstration that contracts have consequences, that underestimating people can be fatal, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, ultimately prevails when pursued with intelligence, determination, and absolute commitment to truth. The boardroom doors opened at exactly 1 o'clock as I carried my leather portfolio containing 18 months of meticulously documented evidence into what would become Marcus Wellington's final meeting as CEO. He was already seated at the head of the mahogany table, shuffling through his presentation materials with the nervous energy of someone whose morning had not proceeded according to plan. The 9 board members took their positions around the polished surface, unaware that they were about to witness the activation of contractual provisions that would fundamentally alter the company's leadership structure. Chairman Harold Fitzgerald called the meeting to order with his usual formal precision, but I could detect underlying tension in his voice stemming from his earlier conversation with Marcus about the Henderson account situation. Patricia Williams sat directly across from Marcus, her legal pad already open and her pen poised to take detailed notes about whatever explanations he might offer for the morning's client relations disaster. The other board members appeared focused but relaxed, expecting a routine quarterly review rather than the comprehensive revelation of executive misconduct they were about to experience. Marcus launched into his prepared remarks with forced confidence, attempting to control the narrative before questions could arise about his failed performance during the Henderson meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to report another quarter of strategic progress and operational excellence under the leadership framework I've been implementing across all company divisions, he began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to having his statements accepted without challenge. His presentation slides appeared on the wall-mounted screen, displaying carefully selected metrics that painted an artificially positive picture of company performance while omitting the declining trends that told the actual story of his leadership impact. Revenue numbers were presented without context about client retention rates, profit margins were displayed without reference to unsustainable cost-cutting measures, and operational efficiency statistics ignored the employee turnover crisis that was undermining long-term productivity. Patricia Williams interrupted Marcus's presentation with the first substantive question, her legal training evident in the precision of her inquiry. Marcus, before we proceed with quarterly metrics, I'd like to understand the Henderson account situation that Harold mentioned. Can you explain what happened during this morning's client meeting and how it relates to our broader account management strategies? Marcus's face flushed slightly as he realized that his attempt to control the meeting agenda was being derailed by questions about his most recent failure. Patricia, the Henderson situation actually demonstrates an important issue we need to address regarding employee boundaries and client relationship management, he replied, immediately deflecting responsibility while characterizing his failure as a systemic problem requiring policy intervention. What I observed this morning was an inappropriate attempt by junior staff to develop exclusive client relationships that bypass executive oversight and strategic coordination, Marcus continued, his revision of events becoming more audacious with each sentence. While Jennifer Martinez has been competent in her technical execution role, the client's attempt to negotiate expanded services directly with her represents a violation of our organizational hierarchy that could undermine effective account management. Harold Fitzgerald's expression shifted from confusion to concern as he processed Marcus's characterization of client preference for a competent employee as a management problem. Marcus, are you saying that clients specifically requested to work with Jennifer rather than through normal channels, and that you view this as problematic rather than as evidence of her exceptional performance? The question exposed the fundamental absurdity of Marcus's positioning, forcing him to either admit that clients preferred working with Jennifer because of her superior competence, or to continue defending the indefensible position that client satisfaction was somehow threatening to company interests. Marcus chose the latter approach, revealing the depth of his narcissistic inability to accept that other people might be more effective than himself. Harold, the issue isn't Jennifer's technical competence, which is adequate for her current responsibilities, Marcus replied with condescending precision. The problem is that allowing individual employees to develop personal relationships with major clients creates dependency risks and undermines our ability to maintain strategic control over account development and pricing negotiation. Patricia Williams leaned forward with obvious skepticism about Marcus's explanation. Marcus, in my experience, clients who specifically request to work with particular employees are demonstrating competence in those individuals' capabilities and effectiveness. Are you suggesting that we should discourage client satisfaction in order to maintain some abstract notion of executive control? Marcus's answer revealed his complete disconnection from basic business principles and his dangerous tendency to prioritize personal authority over company welfare. Patricia, what I'm suggesting is that we need policies that prevent individual employees from leveraging client relationships to circumvent executive decision-making authority. If we allow staff members to negotiate directly with clients about expanded services, we lose control over strategic direction and operational coordination. The silence that followed Marcus's response was profound and uncomfortable as board members processed the implications of his position. He was essentially arguing that client satisfaction and employee competence were threats to be managed rather than assets to be celebrated and leveraged. His fundamental misunderstanding of effective leadership and client relationship management was becoming impossible to ignore or rationalize. I stood from my corner position and approached the table, my movement causing several board members to look up with surprise at the unexpected interruption from someone they viewed as administrative support staff. Miss Chairman, I need to invoke Section 12A of my employment contract regarding strategic consulting authority, I announced, my voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had prepared extensively for this moment. Marcus's face went white as he struggled to process what he was hearing. Sarah, this is a board meeting for senior executives and directors only. Please return to your administrative duties and we'll address any employment matters through appropriate channels, he stammered, his voice revealing panic despite his attempt to maintain authority. Harold Fitzgerald looked confused but intrigued by my reference to specific contractual provisions. Miss Chen, could you explain what Section 12A entails and why you believe it's relevant to our current discussion? He asked, his legal background making him naturally curious about contractual language he didn't recognize. I opened my portfolio and removed the relevant contract pages, placing them on the table where board members could examine the language that Marcus had never bothered to read carefully. Section 12A grants me authority to intervene in executive decision-making when such decisions pose documented threats to company welfare, legal compliance, or fiduciary responsibility, I explained, watching Marcus's expression cycle through disbelief, confusion, and growing alarm. Patricia Williams reached for the contract pages with obvious professional interest, her legal expertise immediately recognizing the significance of the carefully crafted language. This is highly unusual contract language, she observed, reading through the provisions with mounting surprise. Miss Chen, This clause appears to grant you substantial authority over corporate governance matters. How did such provisions end up in an administrative assistant's employment agreement? Marcus attempted to regain control of the situation through his usual combination of bluster and intimidation. This is ridiculous. Sarah is my administrative assistant, not some kind of corporate oversight authority. Whatever contract language she's referring to was obviously included by mistake or misunderstanding. We need to return to our scheduled agenda and address this employment matter privately. I smiled calmly while removing additional documents from my portfolio, including my actual educational credentials and professional background information that revealed the true scope of my qualifications. Mr. Wellington, there was no mistake in the contract language. Section 12A was included specifically to provide authority for situations exactly like the one your misconduct has created. Harold Fitzgerald examined my educational documents with growing amazement, reading aloud the degrees and certifications that completely contradicted Marcus's characterization of my capabilities. Dr. Sarah Chen, Juris Doctor from Harvard Law School, Master of Business Administration from Wharton, Master of Science in Strategic Management from Stanford. He read, his voice reflecting his shock at discovering the true qualifications of someone Marcus had dismissed as merely administrative support. The board members exchanged glances of confusion and concern as they realized that Marcus had been systematically underestimating and misrepresenting someone whose qualifications far exceeded his own. Patricia Williams continued reading through the strategic consulting clause, her legal expertise helping her understand the implications of the authority it granted and the circumstances under which it could be activated. Miss Chen, this contract language is extraordinarily sophisticated and comprehensive, Patricia observed, looking up from the documents with professional admiration. The provisions you're invoking appear to have been crafted by someone with extensive knowledge of corporate law and governance principles. Can you explain how you came to be employed in an administrative capacity despite qualifications that would normally merit senior executive consideration? Marcus interrupted desperately, his voice rising with panic as he realized that his authority was being systematically undermined by revelations he couldn't control or explain. This entire situation is irregular and inappropriate. Sarah was hired as my administrative assistant, and whatever academic credentials she might possess don't change her employment status or grant her authority to disrupt board meetings. I removed another set of documents from my portfolio, these ones containing the comprehensive evidence of Marcus's misconduct that I had been gathering for 18 months. Mr. Chairman, Section 12A requires me to present documented evidence of the executive misconduct that triggered my intervention authority, I explained, distributing thick folders to each board member while Marcus watched in growing horror. The folders contained meticulously organized evidence of environmental violations, financial irregularities, employment law violations, and systematic theft of employee contributions, each category supported by audio recordings, email correspondence, regulatory documents, and expert analysis. Patricia Williams opened her folder first, her legal training, helping her immediately recognize the significance and implications of the documented misconduct. These are allegations of criminal environmental violations, Patricia said quietly, reading through Linda Rodriguez's documentation of contamination levels and Marcus's instructions to conceal regulatory violations. Chen, this suggests systematic concealment of environmental damage that could result in federal criminal charges and massive civil liability. Harold Fitzgerald was examining the financial irregularities section, his business experience helping him understand the implications of the accounting manipulations and fraudulent reporting that Thomas Wright had identified. Marcus, these documents suggest systematic manipulation of financial reports and misuse of company resources for personal expenses, he said, his voice carrying profound disappointment rather than anger. Marcus attempted one final desperate defense, his voice cracking under the pressure of watching his carefully constructed facade crumble in real time. Harold, These are obviously fabricated allegations, created by a disgruntled employee seeking to undermine legitimate executive authority. Sarah has clearly misrepresented her background and qualifications in order to gain access to confidential information that she's now using to create false accusations. I activated the audio recording system in my portfolio, filling the boardroom with Marcus's own voice, explicitly instructing facility managers to falsify environmental monitoring reports. His recorded conversations about stealing credit from Jennifer Martinez, forcing Thomas Wright into retirement, and manipulating financial records provided undeniable evidence that contradicted his claims of innocence and fabrication. The board members listened in stunned silence as Marcus's own words condemned him beyond any possibility of defense or denial. His recorded instructions to discriminate against female and minority job candidates, his explicit plans to claim credit for other people's innovations, and his casual discussions of criminal environmental cover-ups revealed the true scope of his misconduct and moral bankruptcy. Patricia Williams was the first to speak when the recordings concluded, her voice carrying the professional authority of someone trained to evaluate evidence and legal implications. Wellington, these recordings appear to be authentic documentation of criminal behavior including environmental violations, securities fraud, and civil rights violations. The legal exposure you've created for this company is staggering and immediate. Harold Fitzgerald closed his folder with obvious sadness about the betrayal of trust that Marcus's behavior represented. Marcus, your father built this company through integrity and respect for both employees and regulatory responsibility. What you've done represents a complete betrayal of everything he stood for and everything this board expected from your leadership. Marcus made one final attempt to shift blame and avoid responsibility, his voice revealing the desperation of someone whose world was collapsing around him. Harold, you have to understand that running a modern company requires difficult decisions and strategic flexibility. Every successful executive has to make compromises and prioritize company interests over individual preferences. These recordings are taken out of context and don't reflect the broader strategic considerations involved. The pathetic nature of Marcus's defense was obvious to everyone in the room. His attempt to characterize criminal behavior as strategic decision-making revealing his complete disconnection from ethical business practices and legal requirements. His inability to accept responsibility for his actions or acknowledge the harm his decisions had caused demonstrated exactly why his removal was necessary and urgent. I presented the final element of my case by distributing copies of the cease and desist orders that would be filed immediately with federal regulators, law enforcement agencies, and civil rights organizations if the board failed to take immediate corrective action. The legal framework I had constructed would ensure that Marcus's misconduct was addressed comprehensively regardless of the board's response, but their cooperation would determine whether the company could survive the necessary reform. Patricia Williams examined the legal documents with professional appreciation for their thoroughness and strategic sophistication. Miss Chen, these legal filings represent an extraordinary level of preparation and expertise. The evidence you've compiled and the remedial framework you've developed demonstrate capabilities that far exceed anything we've seen from current executive leadership. Harold Fitzgerald looked directly at Marcus with the expression of someone forced to confront a profound personal and professional disappointment. Marcus, effective immediately, you are suspended from all executive duties pending a comprehensive investigation of the allegations Chen has presented. Security will escort you from the building while we determine the appropriate permanent response to your misconduct. Marcus's final words as security personnel entered the boardroom revealed the narcissistic delusion that had driven his destructive behavior throughout his tenure as CEO. Harold, you're making a terrible mistake. This company needs strong leadership, not weak capitulation to employee manipulation and regulatory intimidation. You'll regret this decision when you realize what I've accomplished here. The boardroom fell silent as Marcus was escorted out, his departure marking the end of an era of toxic leadership and the beginning of a comprehensive reformation that would restore the company's integrity and effectiveness. Patricia Williams was already reviewing the legal requirements for immediate reporting of environmental violations, while Harold Fitzgerald was preparing to contact federal regulators about the company's cooperation with criminal investigation. The strategic consulting clause had functioned exactly as designed, providing the legal authority necessary to remove destructive leadership while protecting the company from the consequences of executive misconduct. My 18 months of patient documentation and careful preparation had created the foundation for holding Marcus accountable while implementing the reforms necessary to prevent similar failures in the future. Jennifer Martinez, David Park, Thomas Wright, and Linda Rodriguez would finally receive the recognition and authority their competence deserved, while the company's clients, employees, and stakeholders would benefit from leadership focused on sustainable success rather than narcissistic self-aggrandizement. Justice had been served through patience, intelligence, and absolute commitment to documenting truth rather than accepting comfortable lies. 6 months had passed since Marcus Wellington's dramatic removal from Wellington Dynamics, and the transformation within the company walls was nothing short of miraculous. I stood in my new corner office on the executive floor, watching through floor-to-ceiling windows as employees moved through the lobby with an energy and purpose that had been absent during Marcus's toxic reign. The fear that had once permeated every department had been replaced by genuine collaboration and innovation that exceeded even my most optimistic projections. Jennifer Martinez occupied the office that had once been Marcus's domain, her new title of Chief Strategy Officer reflecting the recognition she had always deserved for her exceptional capabilities. The Henderson account had indeed tripled in value under her direct management, and 3 additional major clients had specifically requested her involvement in their strategic planning processes. Her approach to client relationships prioritized long-term partnership over short-term exploitation, creating sustainable revenue streams that strengthened rather than depleted company resources. The environmental compliance crisis that had threatened criminal prosecution and massive civil penalties had been resolved through comprehensive remediation efforts, led by Linda Rodriguez, who now served as Director of Environmental Affairs with direct board reporting authority. The Texas facility and 2 other locations had been completely renovated to exceed federal standards, and the company had received recognition from environmental advocacy groups for its proactive approach to regulatory compliance and community protection. David Park's innovations had been properly credited and rewarded through his promotion to Chief Technology Officer, a position that allowed his engineering brilliance to influence company-wide operational strategies rather than being confined to individual projects. The manufacturing efficiency improvements he had developed were being licensed to other companies through partnerships that generated substantial additional revenue, while establishing Wellington Dynamics as an industry leader in technological innovation. Thomas Wright had delayed his retirement to serve as interim chief financial officer, while comprehensive forensic audits identified and corrected the accounting irregularities that Marcus had implemented throughout his tenure. The financial manipulations had been more extensive than initially suspected, involving multiple offshore accounts and shell companies that Marcus had used to conceal his theft of company resources. Federal investigators had seized millions of dollars in assets that would be returned to company accounts through civil litigation. The board had unanimously approved my appointment as Chief Executive Officer following a transitional period, where I had demonstrated both the vision and operational expertise necessary to guide the company through comprehensive reformation. My first official act had been implementing the employee recognition and advancement programs that ensured competence and integrity were rewarded rather than punished, creating incentive structures that attracted exceptional talent while discouraging the kind of toxic behavior that Marcus had exemplified. Harold Fitzgerald had privately apologized for the board's failure to recognize Marcus's misconduct earlier, acknowledging that their oversight responsibilities had been compromised by his systematic deception and their own reluctance to question the son of the company's beloved founder. Patricia Williams had spearheaded the development of new governance protocols that would prevent similar failures of executive accountability, ensuring that board oversight included regular direct communication with employees at all organizational levels. The legal consequences for Marcus had been swift and comprehensive, reflecting the severity of his criminal behavior and the extensive documentation that made defense impossible. Environmental violations had resulted in federal charges that carried potential prison sentences exceeding 20 years, while securities fraud and civil rights violations had triggered additional state and federal prosecution. His attempts to claim ignorance or blame subordinates had been demolished by the audio recordings that captured his explicit instructions and criminal intent. Marcus's personal financial situation had deteriorated as rapidly as his legal position, with frozen assets, seized properties, and massive civil judgments that eliminated the luxury lifestyle he had funded through company theft. His country club membership had been revoked, his social connections had evaporated, and his wife had filed for divorce while distancing herself from his criminal activities. The man who had once mocked others for their modest circumstances now faced a future of incarceration and financial ruin. The company's financial performance had improved dramatically under ethical leadership that prioritized sustainable growth over manipulated quarterly results. Employee retention rates had reached industry-leading levels as competent professionals who had been driven away by Marcus's toxic management returned to work in an environment that valued their contribution. Client satisfaction scores had improved across all metrics as relationship management focused on partnership rather than exploitation. Rebecca Thompson had returned to lead the marketing department after receiving assurances that the nepotistic practices that had driven her away had been permanently eliminated. Her expertise and industry relationships had already generated new business opportunities that exceeded the revenue lost during her absence, demonstrating the actual cost of Marcus's discriminatory decision-making. Bradley Morrison, Marcus's golf partner's nephew, had been reassigned to an entry-level position appropriate to his qualifications, while receiving mentoring support to develop genuine competence. The Henderson account expansion had become a showcase for the company's transformed approach to client relationships, with Margaret Hendricks serving as a reference for potential clients who wanted to understand the difference between exploitation-based business practices and partnership-oriented collaboration. James Chen and Victoria Rodriguez had become informal ambassadors for the company's reformed culture, recommending Wellington Dynamics to industry colleagues who sought vendors committed to ethical business practice. Linda Rodriguez's environmental compliance programs had been adopted as industry best practices, with other companies requesting consulting services to implement similar protocols at their own facility. The environmental remediation costs that Marcus had viewed as threats to profitability had actually created new revenue streams, while protecting communities and enhancing the company's reputation for corporate responsibility. The Texas facility had become a model for environmental stewardship, with monitoring systems that exceeded regulatory requirements, and community outreach programs that educated local residents about environmental protection. The contamination that Marcus had concealed through fraudulent reporting had been completely remediated, with independent testing confirming that air and water quality had been restored to safe levels. David Park's technology licensing agreements had generated unexpected revenue streams that more than compensated for the short-term costs of his innovation program. Companies across multiple industries were implementing his manufacturing efficiency protocols, creating ongoing royalty income while establishing Wellington Dynamics as a leader in technological development. His approach to problem-solving emphasized sustainability and scalability rather than quick fixes that created long-term complications. Thomas Wright's forensic financial analysis had revealed the true scope of Marcus's theft and manipulation, with recovered assets exceeding initial estimates as investigators uncovered additional hidden accounts and fraudulent transactions. The company's credit rating had been restored following comprehensive audits that demonstrated the elimination of deceptive accounting practices and the implementation of transparent financial reporting protocols. My own transformation from overlooked assistant to recognized leader had become a case study in the importance of recognizing talent regardless of stereotypes or assumptions about role limitation. Business schools were requesting permission to document the strategic consulting clause and its implementation as an example of innovative corporate governance that protected stakeholder interests while ensuring executive accountability. The shell companies I had used to place myself within Wellington Dynamics had been dissolved following the successful completion of their intended purpose, with all assets transferred to legitimate business entities that supported ongoing operations and employee development programs. The headhunting firm that had facilitated my placement had been revealed as a legitimate consulting organization that specialized in identifying and placing exceptional candidates in strategic positions where their capabilities could address specific organizational challenges. Jennifer's success story had inspired other companies to reevaluate their employee recognition and advancement practices, with several organizations requesting consulting services to identify and develop overlooked talent within their own workforce. Her approach to strategic planning emphasized employee empowerment and client partnership rather than hierarchical control and competitive manipulation. The quarterly board meetings had become collaborative strategic planning sessions rather than performative presentations designed to conceal problems and deflect responsibility. Directors engaged directly with department heads and key employees to understand operational realities and identify opportunities for improvement. The transparency and accountability that had been absent during Marcus's tenure were now embedded in corporate culture through formal policies and informal practice. Marcus's criminal trials had attracted media attention that highlighted the importance of corporate accountability and employee protection, with legal commentators noting the innovative use of contractual provisions to prevent and address executive misconduct. The strategic consulting clause had been studied by legal scholars as an example of proactive governance that protected stakeholder interests while providing clear authority for intervention when necessary. The employee satisfaction surveys that had been suppressed during Marcus's tenure were now conducted quarterly with results shared transparently throughout the organization. Feedback mechanisms encouraged constructive suggestions for operational improvements while ensuring that concerns about misconduct or discrimination were addressed promptly and effectively. The culture of fear and retaliation that Marcus had fostered had been replaced by trust and collaboration. Employee advancement programs had been restructured to prioritize competence and integrity over personal relationships and political maneuvering. Merit-based promotion criteria eliminated the nepotistic practices that had allowed incompetent individuals to advance while qualified employees were overlooked or marginalized. Professional development opportunities were distributed equitably with funding allocated based on potential impact rather than executive favoritism. The company's reputation for environmental responsibility and social accountability had attracted new clients who prioritized ethical business partnerships over cost considerations alone. Industry recognition for corporate governance and employee relations had enhanced market position while creating recruitment advantages that attracted exceptional talent from competitors who maintained toxic workplace culture. My morning routine now included reviewing employee feedback and strategic planning updates rather than documenting misconduct and gathering evidence of criminal behavior. The energy that had been devoted to building legal cases against destructive leadership was now channeled into developing sustainable growth strategies and innovative solutions to industry challenges. The contract that had seemed like standard employment paperwork to Marcus had proven to be the instrument of his destruction and the foundation for corporate reformation. The fine print that he had ignored contained the seeds of accountability that grew into comprehensive justice when nurtured by patience, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to truth over comfortable lies. Standing in my office as the sun set over a company transformed by the simple principle that competence should be rewarded rather than punished, I reflected on the lesson that Marcus Wellington had learned too late. Underestimating people based on assumptions about their roles or capabilities can be a fatal mistake, especially when those people possess the qualifications, resources, and legal authority to hold powerful individuals accountable for their actions. The strategic consulting clause had been activated only once, but its presence in my contract served as a permanent reminder that executive authority comes with responsibilities that cannot be ignored without consequence. Justice had been served not through dramatic confrontation but through systematic documentation and patient application of legal principles designed to protect stakeholder interests and ensure corporate accountability. The company Marcus had nearly destroyed through his narcissistic leadership and criminal misconduct was now thriving under ethical management that prioritized sustainable success over short-term exploitation. Employee talents were recognized and rewarded. Client relationships were built on partnership rather than manipulation, and regulatory compliance was viewed as community protection rather than bureaucratic inconvenience. The transformation was complete, but the vigilance continued, ensuring that the lessons learned from Marcus Wellington's failure would prevent similar failures in the future while creating an organizational culture where competence, integrity, and accountability were not just encouraged but required for continued success. 2 years had elapsed since the dramatic boardroom confrontation that ended Marcus Wellington's reign of corporate terror, and today I found myself preparing for what would be my final act in this carefully orchestrated drama of justice and transformation. The annual shareholders' meeting was scheduled to begin in 1 hour, marking exactly 24 months since I had activated the strategic consulting clause that changed everything. This gathering would serve as both a celebration of Wellington Dynamics' remarkable recovery and my official transition from crisis management to permanent leadership. The auditorium buzzed with an energy that would have been impossible during Marcus's tenure, filled with shareholders, employees, clients, and industry representatives who had come to witness what business publications were calling the most successful corporate turnaround of the decade. The transformation that had begun with 18 months of patient documentation and careful legal maneuvering had evolved into a comprehensive renaissance that exceeded every optimistic projection. Jennifer Martinez took the stage first, her presentation about strategic partnerships and client relations drawing enthusiastic applause from an audience that understood they were witnessing genuine excellence rather than manipulated statistics. The Henderson account had become the foundation for an entire division focused on long-term client partnerships, generating revenue streams that sustained themselves through value creation rather than exploitative pricing strategy. Her approach had attracted competitors' best clients, who sought the kind of authentic collaboration that Marcus had been incapable of providing. David Park followed with technical innovations that had revolutionized not just Wellington Dynamics, but the entire manufacturing sector through licensing agreements and consulting partnerships. His engineering solutions were being implemented across 4 continents, creating ongoing royalty income while establishing the company as the definitive leader in operational efficiency and environmental sustainability. The recognition he received today represented the vindication of talent that Marcus had attempted to suppress and steal. Linda Rodriguez presented environmental compliance achievements that had transformed regulatory burden into competitive advantage, with Wellington Dynamics now serving as a consultant to government agencies developing new environmental protection standards. The contamination that Marcus had concealed through criminal fraud had been not just remediated but transformed into research opportunities that advanced environmental science while generating positive publicity and revenue streams. Thomas Wright, who had postponed retirement to oversee the financial reconstruction, announced that all assets stolen by Marcus had been recovered through civil litigation, with additional punitive damages funding employee development programs and environmental restoration projects. The accounting systems he had rebuilt emphasized transparency and accountability, creating financial reporting protocols that had become industry standards for corporate governance. The numbers told a story of unprecedented success that vindicated every principle Marcus had violated during his destructive tenure. Employee satisfaction scores had reached the 95th percentile industry-wide, client retention rates exceeded 98%, and financial performance had improved across every meaningful metric. More importantly, these achievements represented sustainable growth built on competence and integrity rather than manipulation and exploitation. The legal proceedings against Marcus had concluded with convictions on multiple federal charges, including environmental crimes, securities fraud, and civil rights violations. His 25-year prison sentence reflected the severity of his criminal behavior and served as a deterrent to other executives who might consider similar abuses of authority. The man who had once mocked others for their modest circumstances now occupied a federal correctional facility where his former arrogance had been replaced by the reality of accountability. His financial destruction had been equally comprehensive, with seized assets, civil judgments, and legal fees eliminating the luxury lifestyle he had funded through corporate theft. The country club memberships, expensive restaurants, and designer clothing that had symbolized his stolen success were now memories from a life that seemed almost fictional in its disconnection from the consequences of his actions. His wife's divorce settlement had been limited to assets predating his criminal behavior, leaving him with nothing but the legal debts accumulated during his failed defense. The board of directors had been reconstituted with new members whose backgrounds emphasized operational expertise and ethical leadership, rather than social connections and political maneuvering. Patricia Williams had been elected chairwoman, bringing legal expertise and governance experience that ensured executive accountability would never again be compromised by personal relationships or willful ignorance. The oversight protocols she had implemented created multiple safeguards against the kind of systematic misconduct that Marcus had perpetrated. Harold Fitzgerald had remained on the board despite his initial support for Marcus, his commitment to learning from past failures, demonstrated through his leadership of the Corporate Governance Reform Committee. His recognition that friendship and family loyalty could not excuse criminal behavior had been difficult but necessary for the company's recovery and future protection. The policies he helped develop ensured that executive performance would be evaluated through objective metrics rather than subjective relationships. The strategic consulting clause that had provided the legal framework for Marcus's removal had been studied by corporate lawyers and governance experts as an innovative approach to executive accountability. Law schools were teaching case studies based on its implementation, and several major corporations had requested assistance developing similar contractual provisions to protect their organizations from destructive leadership. The clause had proven that properly structured employment agreements could serve as powerful tools for corporate reform. My own journey from overlooked assistant to recognized leader had become a symbol of the transformation that was possible when organizations valued competence over politics and substance over appearance. The shell companies and careful positioning that had enabled my placement within Wellington Dynamics were revealed as sophisticated strategic planning rather than deceptive manipulation. The patience and preparation that had seemed excessive during 18 months of documentation were recognized as essential elements of comprehensive justice. The business schools that had initially requested permission to study the strategic consulting clause had expanded their research to include the entire transformation process, from initial placement through final resolution. Graduate students were analyzing every aspect of the operation as an example of how legal expertise, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment to truth could overcome entrenched corruption and systemic dysfunction. Rebecca Thompson's return to the marketing department had catalyzed innovations in client communication and brand development that positioned Wellington Dynamics as an industry leader in corporate transparency and social responsibility. Her campaigns emphasized authentic achievement rather than manipulated perception, creating market differentiation that attracted clients seeking genuine partnership rather than transactional relationship. The nepotistic practices that had driven her away were now historical artifacts of a failed leadership approach. Bradley Morrison, Marcus's golf partner's nephew, had actually benefited from the change in corporate culture through mentoring programs that developed his capabilities rather than advancing him based on family connection. His current position reflected his actual qualifications while providing growth opportunities that were based on merit rather than favoritism. The transformation demonstrated that even beneficiaries of corrupt systems could thrive under ethical leadership when given appropriate support and realistic expectations. The company's reputation for environmental stewardship and social accountability had attracted partnerships with organizations that prioritized sustainable business practices over short-term profit maximization. Industry recognition for corporate governance and employee relations had created recruitment advantages that consistently attracted exceptional talent from competitors who maintained toxic workplace culture. The positive cycle of competence attracting competence had replaced the negative cycle of corruption breeding corruption. Employee advancement programs had produced a new generation of leaders whose careers were built on demonstrated capability rather than political maneuvering or personal relationships. The mentorship networks that connected experienced professionals with developing talent created knowledge transfer systems that strengthened organizational capacity while ensuring that institutional wisdom was preserved and expanded. The culture of fear and competition that Marcus had fostered was replaced by collaboration and mutual support. The quarterly board meetings that had once been theatrical performances designed to conceal problems and deflect responsibility had evolved into genuine strategic planning sessions where directors engaged with operational realities and employee insight. Transparency and accountability were embedded in corporate culture through formal policies that required honest reporting and informal practices that encouraged constructive feedback and continuous improvement. Client testimonials had become powerful marketing tools that demonstrated the difference between partnership-oriented business relationships and exploitation-based transactional arrangements. The Henderson account executives frequently spoke at industry conferences about their experience working with Wellington Dynamics, emphasizing the value of authentic collaboration and long-term thinking. Their endorsements had generated referrals that expanded market reach while maintaining the high-quality relationships that sustained sustainable growth. The environmental restoration projects that had seemed like costly burdens during Marcus's concealment of violations had become sources of positive publicity and community goodwill that enhanced the company's reputation while creating new business opportunities. Local governments and environmental organizations that had once viewed Wellington Dynamics with suspicion now sought partnerships and consulting relationships. The transformation demonstrated that regulatory compliance could be competitive advantage rather than bureaucratic burden. The technology licensing agreements that had originated from David Park's innovations had expanded into comprehensive partnerships with international corporations seeking to implement sustainable manufacturing processes. The royalty income generated by these agreements provided financial stability while establishing Wellington Dynamics as a global leader in environmental technology. The recognition reflected the value of supporting employee innovation rather than suppressing and stealing it. Today's shareholders' meeting represented the culmination of a transformation that had exceeded every expectation while validating the principles that Marcus had violated throughout his destructive tenure. The applause that filled the auditorium reflected genuine appreciation for authentic achievement rather than manipulated performance metrics. The questions from shareholders focused on sustainable growth strategies and long-term value creation rather than short-term profit maximization and accounting manipulation. As I took the stage for my final presentation as crisis manager and my first as permanent CEO, I reflected on the journey that had brought Wellington Dynamics from the brink of criminal prosecution and financial ruin to industry leadership and sustainable prosperity. The patience and preparation that had seemed excessive during 18 months of careful documentation were revealed as essential elements of comprehensive justice and lasting transformation. The strategic consulting clause that had provided the legal authority for intervention had served its purpose and would remain in place as a permanent reminder that executive authority comes with responsibilities that cannot be ignored without consequence. The fine print that Marcus had dismissed as irrelevant had contained the seeds of accountability that grew into comprehensive reform when nurtured by intelligence, determination, and absolute commitment to truth over comfortable deception. The lesson that Marcus Wellington had learned too late in a federal prison cell was now embedded in corporate culture and industry awareness. Underestimating people based on assumptions about their roles or capabilities can be a fatal mistake, especially when those people possess the qualifications, resources, and legal authority to hold powerful individuals accountable for their actions. The transformation of Wellington Dynamics stood as permanent proof that justice, while sometimes delayed, ultimately prevails when pursued with patience, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to doing what is right rather than what is easy. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.